Hi, my name's Ian Stell and I'm going to be doing the first of these tutorials, and I'm going to be talking about what we call knobology, what do all the buttons on an ultrasound machine do, and about transducers or probes. So starting off with knobology. I think when I first started with ultrasound I was sort of intimidated by all of these buttons. You know, if I press the wrong button, what's going to happen? Is it all going to go blank? You know, is it all going to go dark and I'm going to be completely stuck? So that was sort of my original concern, but in fact it's not like that. There are certain controls that you have to use every time you do a scan, and there are other controls that you'll need to use sometimes, and then there's lots of other things you will not need to worry about most of the time. So I'm going to start off with the key things, the things that you need to use whenever you're working with an ultrasound machine. And it's this list here. Apart from turning it on and off, there's the gain and the depth are the most important ones. So I'm going to start off with the gain control. So the gain control is really just brightness. It's at one end of the scale, the screen is completely dark, black. At the other end, it's very bright. And it's about choosing a point between those two that gives you the most detail and information. In fact, there are 256 shades of grey between black and bright white, and it's about getting the most of those in use on your screen so you've got as much detail as possible. That's what you're looking for with gain. So it's a constant adjustment. It's not something you just set up at the beginning of the day. It's something you adjust all the time to give yourself as much detail as possible on the screen. So that's the gain control. Most gain controls are very obvious on the ultrasound machine. It's often a big button. It might have a B on it for brightness mode, I'll come to that, or a 2D on it. And I'll just show a little video here with just a few examples of gain buttons. Here's one on a Logic E, here's another one on a Z6, this machine next to me here, which I'll be using in a minute. Here's one on an old machine, a Sonosite, and showing its gain control at the bottom left-hand corner. So those are gain controls. Increasingly though these days it's touchscreen, and it's a touchscreen button. The next one is depth, the depth control. So the depth control adjusts the depth on the right hand side of the screen. Let me start off by just showing this. So here's an ultrasound machine showing the depth control down the right hand side in centimeters. And that's adjusted by a button. Again, it's usually quite a big button. It's usually quite obvious on the machine. So here's a few examples. This is on the Z6 again, and then I'm going to look at a Sonosite. On a Sonosite, old Sonosites, it's less depth, more depth through these buttons here. As I say, increasingly these days it's by touchscreen controls. So that's depth. So, well, what's the right amount of depth? Let me put it like this. If the thing that you're interested in is all within the top 12 centimeters from the surface of the body, well then just set your depth to 13 or 14. Don't just go for the next nearest round number like 15 or 20. You just want to make everything you're interested in as big as possible on the screen. So that's the depth control. So we normally set it just a bit more than we need, and again we keep adjusting it. It's so often you see somebody working on an ultrasound machine and the bit they're interested in is all right up at the top, and there's all this empty real estate below the bit they're interested in. So that's gain and depth. They're the most important controls, and you'll adjust them all the time. But I want to go on and talk about some of the other controls that we use in ultrasound that we're going to use some of the time. And I'm going to talk about M mode. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about ultrasound and how it works. So here's a probe, okay? Here's a transducer. The magic of the ultrasound machine is the crystal. Yeah? Now, the world is changing a little bit, but until very recently, that's every ultrasound machine worked from these piezoelectric crystals. Arrayed across here are probably 128 or possibly 256 of these crystals. Each of these is connected to the computer, and the computer sends an impulse to each of those crystals, makes it vibrate, and when it vibrates it produces sound. Now you can't hear it, it's 1,000 times higher than audible sound, but that sound propagates into the body, hits something, it comes back, and when it hits the crystal again, it makes it vibrate again, which makes it produce electricity. It's a transducer. It converts sound to electricity, electricity to sound. And so that electric signal then goes to the computer in the ultrasound machine. And what happens is the ultrasound machine gets all of these little bits of information, and around each information it knows three things. It knows which crystal has sent it that information. It knows the delay between the sound leaving and returning to the probe. And it also knows the strength of the signal. So each of those three bits of information goes into a two-dimensional image. I'm going to just put I'm going to put something up so you can see here that I've got at the top here, this triangular image is a two-dimensional image. And this is made up of these three bits of information. You can almost think of it like pixels, like in a digital photo. Across the width, it's produced by which crystal. The depth, of course, the probe's at the top. The depth down of each individual bright spot is determined by the delay, how long the signal took to come back. And then the strength of each bright spot is determined by, again, the intensity of the image coming back. So all that information is put together to produce a two-dimensional image. It's called B mode. Now, it's a bit of an archaic term, but we're sort of stuck with it, and that's B mode, brightness mode ultrasound, so two-dimensional images. So that's what we are used to when we think about cross-sectional anatomy with ultrasound. So what's M mode? So when we're going to use M mode, what we do is we press the M mode button, and rather like on the picture here, it selects one of the crystals. We can change which crystal we've selected, we can move it around, and it chooses that one crystal, and it then in a separate image on the screen shows what's coming back to that crystal stretched over time. So if I set this little video going here, you'll see that the information along the bottom is what's come back to that one crystal, that single crystal, over the last, well, it turns out to be 7 seconds. So that if anything on the image is moving, then we can see that movement stretched out over the last 7 seconds on the screen. And this turns out to be really useful when we look at moving things in the body, particularly, for example, cardiology, looking at valves. We look at the mitral valve. We can see each leaflet. We can freeze the image. We can take measurements. We can see how far the leaflets move apart. We can see a huge amount of information about the leaflets. And that's M mode, which stands for motion mode. So we won't use this very often, but M mode is a useful function which we're going to use from time to time. Okay, I'm going to go on now to talk about Doppler. It's the sort of second of these functions that are useful to use from time to time. So there are many different Doppler functions, and they're a huge part of modern ultrasound, and they have a great deal to add to ultrasound. So let's just think about the background to Doppler. So if you think back to your physics at school, the Doppler phenomenon. You remember if you're standing by the side of a road and a car goes past you, it goes meow as it goes past, yeah? So as it's coming towards you, sound is leaving the engine. A sound wave, as it leaves the engine, the beginning of the wave comes out, but by the time the end of the wave leaves the engine has moved. So the wavelength becomes shorter. The wavelength is shorter, the frequency is higher. So this is why it sounds higher as it approaches you. As it moves away, the wavelength is stretched by the same thing. As the wave finishes leaving the engines move further away, and the wavelength is longer, the frequency is lower. So that's the Doppler phenomenon, the Doppler shift. We see this a lot in physics, in the natural world. For example, in light, we talk about stars having redshift because the faster they're moving away from us, the more the light is changed, the frequency is changed. So what's the relevance of that to ultrasound? Well, let me imagine that this is an ultrasound probe on the skin, yeah, and it's sending a beam into the body, and that beam hits a blood vessel, and there's red cells coming towards the surface. though that beam hits the red cells and bounces back and is picked up by the probe, but its frequency has been adjusted, has been changed by these approaching red cells, which have shortened its wavelength, raising its frequency. Honestly, it's not by a lot, it hasn't changed it a lot, but it is detectable. And the computer is able to extract that information, that shift in frequency, and there are various ways in which it can display that information. We tend to think of colour flow as the most common one, but if you think back to clinical work, for example in patients with vascular disease, we often use Doppler probes there. So we take a probe, we put it on the foot looking for the dorsalis pedis pulse. It sends a beam out, and as the beam comes back to the probe, the frequency shift is picked up by the probe, and it turns out that the shift in frequency, just that change in frequency, is in the audible range. So that the probe then gives you an audible signal, whoosh, 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 something like that, indicating the pulse underneath it. So that's one of the common uses of Doppler. In ultrasound, as I say, colour flow is a common use. So we press the colour button, a box appears on the screen, and we move it perhaps over a black hole that we think might be a vessel, and we get colour. And the colour, it doesn't indicate that it's arterial or venous, it just indicates the direction of movement of flow. And the way that we remember it is BART, B-A-R-T, blue away, red towards. So anything that's moving away from the probe is going to look blue, anything moving towards the probe is going to look red. So that's colour flow Doppler. And there are many other Doppler functions. So for example, rather than colour or sound, it could be numerical with a higher number for a higher flow rate. And so from that we can then get the flow rate in chambers of the heart and integrate it and get volumes and work out details to do with the dynamic function of the heart. So Doppler's a very powerful set of tools within ultrasound which give ultrasound a great deal of usability with fluid flow. Now we're not going to use a lot of it in the course, but we are going to use a little bit, and it's really one of the main uses is that a blood vessel? You know, can I look at it? Can I look at the flow? If we're looking at it to decide if it's an artery or a vein, which is something we're often interested in, we don't go by the colour, we go by the character of the pulsation. Arterial pulsation has a distinctive character to it, whereas venous pulsation, of course, veins have variation in the flow, but it's more complicated because it's affected both by cardiac function and by respiratory function. So that's Doppler flow. What about other things? Now, the next thing I'm going to come to is something called time gain compensation. Now, this is a bit of a mouthful, but what does it mean? Well, on most ultrasound machines, you'll see that they'll have a bank of sliding controls like these. It may be touchscreen or it may be physical controls. And if you ever watch a radiologist working in a darkened room doing an abdominal ultrasound, they will take a great deal of care in the adjustment of the TGC in certain types of scanning. So why? What's that all about? What's the TGC about? Well, to understand it, we have to talk about attenuation. So I think you'd agree with me, if I put a probe on the skin, and here's the skin, and send a beam into the body, it's going to get weaker as it goes into the body, isn't it? It's going to gradually get more attenuated, weaker. If we then took the echoes coming back to the probe and put it straight onto the screen, what would happen is every ultrasound image would be bright at the top and then get progressively darker as you go down. Well, that's no good, is it? You know, if you were looking, for example, at two lymph nodes, here's one near the surface, here's one deeper down, you want them to look the same on the screen. You don't want one to be brighter and another darker, because that will be misleading as you look at complex anatomy. So the ultrasound machine automatically adds extra gain as you go down. So it amplifies the signal for successively deeper echoes. And of course that means successively later echoes, and hence the name time gain compensation. Okay, so it's built into the ultrasound machine. But of course the ultrasound machine doesn't know where you're scanning. It doesn't know which part of the body you're scanning. So some parts of the body attenuate signals more rapidly than others. For example, if you're over the urinary bladder or the gallbladder, fluid doesn't weaken the signal very much, so the signal stays strong all the way through. But other structures with more detail, more echoes, attenuate more rapidly, and so you're going to need to turn up your TGC at that part of the depth of the image. So that's time gain compensation. To be honest, we're not going to use it a lot on the course. It's not going to matter to us very much. But if we were, for example, looking at the liver, if you're a radiologist and you're looking for fine detail, you're looking for a metastasis or something, you're going to want the liver to look uniform all the way down from the anterior to the posterior parts of the image. So that's TGC. One other control that's you're going to use occasionally, and to be honest, we're not going to use it very much, is focus. And it forms part of optimizing the image along with depth and gain. You can also adjust focus. So what's the focus about? Well, the ultrasound machine produces sound, and the ultrasound comes out of the probe, but it doesn't come out parallel. What happens is that as the sound is focused, so as it comes out, it narrows and then diverges again. And it turns out that where the sound is more dense and nearer than that are the areas where you get most detail in ultrasound. And so we can adjust the focus in many machines, most machines, to different depths so that at that depth or slightly closer, we get that much more detail. The focus is usually indicated by a symbol, often a triangle, in the same scale as the depth on the right-hand side. So you turn the focus and the focal point, the triangle, moves up and down to the relevant depth. So that's focus. Again, we're not going to use it very much. It doesn't make a huge difference, generally speaking, but it is useful. So those are our second order controls. So we've talked about M mode and about TGC and about Doppler functions and about focus. So where are these buttons on a machine? Well, they vary. These machines are machines with the traditional hard buttons, and they're often sort of scattered around. Here's a series of them here. Here's on the Z6, a Mindray machine. You see a number of them above the trackball. And on this older Sonosite, there's a number of them over on the right-hand side. Again, on a number of machines these days, it's all touchscreen. But you just need to know your machine and see where all of these functions are scattered around on the desktop or on the surface of the machine. Okay, so we've talked about the most important buttons, gain, depth, the second order buttons, M mode, Doppler, etc. So what's everything else for? What's all these other buttons on a machine for? Why do we need all these other buttons? Well, a lot of them are for three particular areas of use. Many of them are to do with putting patient information in. So when you start a new patient, you'll often have to put the hospital number in, the patient's name, date of birth, etc. All those sorts of details, or find the patient on a work list if you're working through a work list. So a lot of the buttons are to do with that. A number of the buttons are to do with putting additional information into the image along with the section of the body. So, for example, you might want to write some text explaining, what you were looking for when you did that image. This was near the site of maximal tenderness or whatever. Information that will help you when you look back at that image in a year's time or whatever to know what it was for. And you can also add what are known as pictograms. So here's some examples of pictograms that they're just simplified anatomy so that as you look at your image, you know, okay, that's where I was when I took that image, and that was what it was all about. And sometimes that's useful, particularly if it's a sort of more complex image. Other controls are all to do with saving or storing the image. A number of ways you can save the image. You can save it onto a USB stick, or you can save it in the hospital into the Diagnostic Imaging Communication System, or DICOM as it's usually called, which is the system that keeps the information for all diagnostic imaging so that other people can access your image from elsewhere in the organization. And honestly, those account for most of the other controls in an ultrasound machine. Okay, so that brings us on to the subject of probes or transducers. Now, when you buy an ultrasound machine, generally speaking, you look in the catalogue and there are a number of different probes available, but they fall into 4 families. Now, we're not going to use one of those families. That's what's called the cavity probes. So that's what you're going to use if you're going to do a rectal ultrasound or a vaginal ultrasound. We're not going to be using those in emergency settings, but we are going to be using the other 3 families. So let's look at examples from each of those. So first of all, on the left-hand side here, we've got the real workhorse of ultrasound. It's the one I've got in my hand here, which is the curvilinear probe. So this probe, if I put my pointer down, this probe is, the crystals have been designed as an array. They've been designed as a curve so that the image spreads out. It spreads out from this. And the reason for that is so that as the beam goes into the body, you can see successively wider area as you go deeper down. So that's the curvilinear probe. It really only works on a soft bit of the body because the body has to conform to that curve. It's not going to work on a fetal skull, for example. It tends to be called the abdominal probe because that's where it's going to work. In emergency settings, we're going to use it a lot for different abdominal conditions, and it's also used in obstetrics and gynecology and so on. And that's the curvilinear. Now, there's a few things we need to know about each probe. First of all, the frequency. Now, this is called a low-frequency probe. In many machines, you can adjust the frequency, but it's usually somewhere around 1 to 4 megahertz. Now, that may not sound a very low frequency, but that's what a low-frequency probe is, what we mean by a low-frequency probe, 1 to 4. And I'm going to use the number 4 megahertz. So how deep will that go into the human body? Well, generally speaking, about 30 centimeters. So that's about because I still think in old money, that's about a foot. That's about how far it'll go into the human body. So when you've got a British standard abdomen, that's how far into it you can go with your curvilinear probe. Okay. So that's the curvilinear. The next one on the image is the linear array, and that's called that because the crystals are aligned in a straight line on the face of the probe. And that means that the beam is parallel-sided, it doesn't spread out, and as a result, the image on the screen always looks square or rectangular. These are really great probes. These are high-frequency probes, the linear array, because they give you really clear detail. The frequency is about 3 times as high as a curvilinear, maybe around 12 megahertz. And what that means in effect is that for each one piece of information with a curvilinear probe, because you've got 3 waves in the same wavelength, you've got 3 pieces of information, roughly, for a linear array. So you get 3 times as much detail. And so it's a much more detailed image. So we like the linear array for detailed stuff, but the downside of that is penetration. Penetration is much less. And generally speaking, we're going to use the linear array for a few centimeters, maybe 5 centimeters from the surface. They will often go to 10, but it's usually used for 1, 2, 3, 4 centimeters from the surface. And it gives a great deal of detail. It tends to be called the vascular probe because that's what it's been most known for, the vascular probe. But we also use it it's used for musculoskeletal, for ligament tears, rotator cuff tears, Achilles tendon tears, for foreign bodies, for abscesses, for pneumothorax assessment, etc. A number of other surface uses that we use the linear array for. The third probe here, I'm sure you'll recognize this, the third probe on the screen is the one that we use for the heart, the cardiac probe. So let me just say a little bit about that because I think the history is relevant to this. When ultrasound started to be used clinically, so it had come out of sonar and so on from ships and so on, when it started to be used clinically, which is really about the late 70s, I think, there was a great deal of interest in looking at the heart. Now, up until that time, we didn't have any way of looking inside the heart of a living person. We could take a history, we could listen with a stethoscope, we could do an ECG, we could do a chest x-ray and get the shape of the heart. But there wasn't any way that we could look inside the heart. We couldn't look at the aortic valve or the mitral valve. But here was a technology which had the promise of showing us into the heart and assessing the heart in detail. But the problem is that the heart is surrounded by structures that you can't scan through. So you can't scan through air, you can't scan through bone. But the heart is surrounded by the lungs with air in them, by bones, the sternum, the ribs, etc., that you can't scan through. So you needed a probe that would allow you to look in between the ribs and then would create an image which widened out behind the ribs. So the first approach to this was to get your crystal on a pivot and make it sweep, a bit like how radar sweeps through the sky, was to get your beam to sweep a sector and back again and go very fast across a sector. So it was pivoted, and that was known as a sector scanner, and it would rattle in your hand. And that was the first approach, and so it would produce echoes bouncing back as it swept through an arc. So that's a sector scanner, but they are prone to mechanical difficulties and so on. Later it was worked out that if you delay signals from your crystals, and this is all to do with interference and so on, you can actually produce the same effect, a swept effect, without any mechanical movement. And so now we use what's called phased array probes, and they have the same effect. They produce a triangular image, but they do it non-mechanically, and so they're now called a phased array. So, you know, when you talk about a cardiac probe or an echo probe, it could be called a sector scanner or a phased array probe, but they all are the same, mean the same thing. So what's the frequency of a cardiac probe? Well, it's a low frequency probe. It's the same frequency as a curvilinear. It's 4 megahertz, around that, you know, it may be variable. So its penetration is around the same, 30 centimeters, something like that. However, you might think, okay, so they produce the same images then, curvilinear probe or a phased array probe. You'll get the same image, just a different shape image on the screen. Well, in fact, that's not true. There's a bit more to it than that. And this is where the subject of presets comes up. If you turn on any ultrasound machine and choose a probe, as you choose the probe, it will usually ask you, what do you want to use the probe for? So are you going to use this vascular probe to look at a blood vessel, or are you going to look at the lung, or are you going to look at soft tissue, etc.? And when you choose that, when you choose whichever of those options, the computer will load some additional software designed to clean up the image, to give you the best quality image you can in that application. This is really important, particularly, for example, in echo probes. The heart creates a lot of reverberation and a lot of artifactual stuff. And a lot of work has gone into these presets designed to sort of clean up the image and give you as sharp and clear an image of the heart as possible. So any application with ultrasound, you make use of the presets, and that will give you the best possible functionality, the best possible images in that situation. Okay, so those are your 3 main probes: curvilinear, linear array, and cardiac probes. I just have one more subject really to talk about. Okay, and that's about gel. So, gel. And I want to just talk about ultrasound for a moment. Why does an ultrasound signal going into the body come back to the probe again? Don't forget, in order to give you detail as it goes through the body, some ultrasound needs to bounce back, but some of it has to carry on, because you want some to carry on and pick up more information from deeper and deeper in the body. So you want both echoes and penetration. So what is it that makes ultrasound bounce? You know, if you think about shouting across a valley to a cliff, you hear the echo from the cliff on the other side. What is it that made that sound bounce back from the cliff towards you? Well, it turns out to be changes in the speed of sound. It's something called acoustic impedance is its proper term. But it really is, if you think about it in terms of density, it's a change in density. Where there's a change in density, sound bounces. So as the ultrasound goes through the body and hits a change in density, it bounces back. It bounces back to the probe. The more the density changes, the more sound bounces. So where you have a big change, nearly all of the sound bounces back. And this is one of the problems when scanning within the body. So if we think about densities in the human body, we tend to think about 4 fundamental densities in the human body. Now, it's a simplification, but you've got bone, you've got air in the lungs and in the gut and places like that. You've got fat, which has just got a slightly lower density than water. And then most other things are water density. So tissues, blood, the liver, the kidney, the spleen, and so on. They're all around water density. Now, it turns out that ultrasound works within water density. So from the probe through to whatever you're interested in, you have to have a pathway through structures that are of water density in order to allow the beam to get right the way through to what you're interested in. If you're looking at the ovaries, you've got to have a water density path all the way there and all the way back again. So gel, of course, is water density. It goes on the probe and onto the skin. It allows the beam to get into the body. If you don't put gel on your probe, if you have your probe without any gel on it, then the beam hits the surface, but the density change to air is too great, and the beam just bounces back, goes straight back inside the probe again. So you need the gel on it to get the beam to go into the body and travel through. So that's why gel is so important, and that's why ultrasound is really all about water density. If you hit bone, you hit air, you're not going to get anything. And so this is one of the issues in clinical practice, and why you can't scan through the lungs, you can't scan through the gut, etc. But where you've got fluid density structures, you can get all the way through. Okay, well that covers all I was going to say about knobology and about transducers. So we've talked about the buttons, the key buttons that you need to know about on an ultrasound machine. And we've talked about the probes that we're going to be using. We're going to be using all of these on the course: the curvilinear, the linear array, and the echo probe, the cardiac probe.